The dust clouds rolled across the New Mexico desert like angry waves, and Jake Morrison knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary storm. He had lived on his small ranch for 30 years, and he barely scraped by with a handful of cattle and dreams that had dried up like the creek beds in summer. His truck was older than most marriages, and his house needed repairs he couldn't afford, and his bank account had more cobwebs than dollars. The wind picked up that evening, and it carried the smell of something strange and something wrong. Jake stood on his porch watching the sky turn colors that nature never intended, and he felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. The crash came just after sunset, and it shook the ground so hard that Jake thought it was an earthquake. His cattle scattered in every direction, and their panicked bellowing filled the air. Jake grabbed his flashlight and his grandfather's old rifle, and he headed toward the source of the noise, even though every instinct told him to run the other way. The walk took him 20 minutes through the scrub brush and over the rocky terrain until he reached the ravine behind his property. What he saw there made him stop dead in his tracks. A craft of some kind had torn through the earth and left a scar that was at least 100 feet long. The metal or whatever it was made of shimmered with colors that hurt to look at directly. Pieces of the ship were scattered everywhere, and some of them were still glowing hot. Jake approached carefully with his rifle raised, even though he had no idea what good it would do against whatever had fallen from the sky. Then he saw them. 2 figures lay near the wreckage, and they were both massive and easily 8 feet tall. Their skin was bronze-colored, and it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. They wore armor that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced at the same time. Their faces were proud and angular, with high cheekbones and long black hair that fell past their shoulders. Jake's first thought was that they looked like the Apache warriors from the old photographs he had seen in history books, but that made no sense at all. The female opened her eyes as Jake got closer, and those eyes were golden like honey held up to sunlight. She tried to speak, but the words came out in a language that sounded like wind rushing through canyons. Her brother lay unconscious beside her, and blood that had a strange silver shimmer to it leaked from a deep wound in his chest. The female tried to sit up, but her leg was bent at an angle that made Jake feel sick to his stomach. She looked at Jake with those impossible golden eyes, and he saw pain there, but also something else, and that something was hope. Jake lowered his rifle, and he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't leave them here to die, and it didn't matter that they were aliens or that they could probably kill him without much effort. They needed help, and Jake Morrison had never been the kind of man who could walk away from someone in need no matter how scared he was. He knelt down beside the female, and he held up his hands to show he meant no harm. She studied him for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly. Getting them back to his ranch house was the hardest thing Jake had ever done in his life. The female helped as much as she could, but her broken leg made every step agony. Her brother was completely unconscious, and moving him was like trying to drag a boulder uphill. Jake's back screamed in protest, and his muscles burned, but he kept going. It took hours, and by the time they reached his house, the sun was starting to come up again. Jake cleared out his small living room, and he pushed all his furniture against the walls. He brought every blanket and pillow he owned, and he made beds on the floor for his strange guests. The female watched him work, and her expression was difficult to read. When Jake finally finished, she reached out with one massive hand, and she touched his shoulder gently. The gesture felt significant somehow, and Jake got the sense that she was thanking him in a way that went deeper than words. He spent the next hour gathering supplies and trying to figure out how to help them. The female's leg needed to be set, and her brother's chest wound needed to be cleaned and bandaged. Jake had basic first aid knowledge from his years of ranching, but this was way beyond anything he had dealt with before. Still, he did his best, and he worked carefully, and the female seemed to understand what he was trying to do. She guided his hand sometimes, and she showed him where to apply pressure and how to wrap the bandages. By the time Jake finished treating their wounds, he was exhausted and his hands were shaking. He sat down heavily on his old couch, and he looked at the 2 giants sleeping on his floor. What had he gotten himself into, and what was he supposed to do now? He couldn't call the police or the government because they would take the aliens away and probably lock Jake up too. He couldn't tell anyone because who would believe him? He was stuck with 2 injured aliens in his living room, and no plan for what came next. The female opened her eyes again, and she looked directly at Jake. She spoke, and this time he could almost understand some of the words. She was learning English somehow and learning it fast. She pointed to herself, and she said something that sounded like Nashota. Then she pointed to her brother, and she said something that sounded like Ahiga. Jake pointed to himself and he said his name slowly and clearly. Nashota repeated it and she smiled for the first time. That smile transformed her face and made her look less alien and more human. Jake knew his life would never be the same again and he had no idea if he had made the right choice. But as he watched Nashota close her eyes and drift back to sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he mattered and like he was doing something important and like maybe his small life on this failing ranch had led to this moment for a reason. The storm had brought these strangers to him and now they were his responsibility. Jake Morrison didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, and that was that he would protect these two with everything he had. The first 3 days were the hardest and Jake barely slept as he watched over his strange guests. Nashota's English improved with frightening speed, and by the second morning she could form simple sentences. By the third day they were having real conversations and Jake learned things that made his head spin. She told him that her people came from far away, and that they had been exploring when their ship malfunctioned. She didn't explain everything yet, but Jake could tell she was holding back important information. Ahiga woke up on the 4th day, and he came awake violently. He thrashed and reached for weapons that weren't there, and he nearly knocked Jake across the room before Nashota calmed him down. She spoke to her brother in their native language, and the words sounded musical and harsh at the same time. Ahiga's golden eyes fixed on Jake, and for a moment Jake thought he was going to die. Then Nashota said something else, and Ahiga relaxed slowly. He studied Jake for a long moment before he spoke. His first words in English were simple and direct. He told Jake that he had saved their lives and that this created a bond between them. He said this bond was sacred and could not be broken. Jake didn't fully understand what that meant, but he nodded anyway. Ahiga then did something that shocked Jake completely. The massive warrior bowed his head and he placed his fist over his heart in a gesture of respect. Nashota did the same, and Jake felt deeply uncomfortable with the whole thing. Over the next few days, Jake learned more about the twins and their incredible story. They came from a world called Dineta, and they were part of something called the Federation. Nashota explained that their people were descended from Earth's indigenous tribes, and that thousands of years ago visitors had come to this planet. These visitors hadn't come to conquer or to take resources. They had come seeking refuge from a terrible war that was tearing the galaxy apart. The ancient visitors found kindred spirits in Earth's native peoples, and especially in the tribes of North America. They shared knowledge and technology, and eventually they shared something more important. They shared their very genetics. When the visitors were called back to the stars to continue their fight, they took volunteers with them. These volunteers became the ancestors of people like Nashota and Ahiga. They carried the traditions and the warrior spirit of Earth's tribes out into the cosmos. Jake listened to all of this and he tried to wrap his mind around it. Nashota told him that the Apache and the Navajo and the Lakota and all the great peoples of the Americas hadn't disappeared or been destroyed. They had ascended to the stars. They walked among the galaxies now as warriors and protectors of 1,000 different worlds. The twins were part of this legacy and they carried the old ways in their hearts even though they had never set foot on Earth until now. Ahiga's wound healed remarkably fast, and within a week he was moving around almost normally. Nashota's leg took longer, but she was patient, and she spent her time teaching Jake about the stars. She told him about worlds where the sky was green and planets where 3 suns rose every morning. She described space stations the size of moons and ships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye. Jake felt like a child listening to fairy tales, except these fairy tales were real. But there was something the twins weren't telling him, and Jake could sense it. He saw the way they looked at each other when they thought he wasn't watching. He noticed how Nashota would sometimes stop mid-sentence and change the subject. He caught Ahiga staring at the sky with an expression that looked like dread. Finally, Jake couldn't take it anymore and he demanded to know the truth. The twins exchanged a long look and then Nashota sighed. She told Jake to sit down because what she had to say was going to be difficult to hear. Jake sat on his worn couch and he waited. Nashota began to speak and her words fell on him like hammer blows. She and Ahiga hadn't just been exploring when their ship crashed. They had been running, and they had been running from something terrible. There was an enemy out there in the darkness, between stars, and this enemy was called the Swarm. They were machines that had been given hunger and purpose. They consumed entire worlds and left nothing behind but dust and silence. The Swarm didn't negotiate and they didn't show mercy. They simply devoured everything in their path and then they moved on to the next target. Nashota's voice shook as she described planets she had seen that the Swarm had destroyed. Ahiga took over the story and his voice was grim. He told Jake that they had been scouting ahead of a swarm fleet when their ship was damaged. They managed to escape, but their navigation systems were destroyed. They had jumped blindly through space and they had ended up here. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the swarm was coming to Earth and they were coming soon. Jake felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. He asked how long they had and Nashoda looked away. She said maybe 3 months or maybe 4. The swarm had detected Earth years ago and they were making their way here. Humanity had no idea what was coming and they had no defense against it. Earth's weapons were primitive compared to what the swarm possessed. When they arrived, it would be a massacre. Jake stood up and he paced across his small living room. He asked why the Federation hadn't warned Earth already if they knew the swarm was coming. Ahiga's expression turned bitter, and he explained about Federation law. Earth was a protected world, but it was also quarantined. The Federation couldn't make contact until humanity reached the stars on their own. Until humanity proved they were ready to join the galactic community, they had to be left alone. It was a stupid law and Ahiga said so, but it was the law nonetheless. Jake felt anger rise in his chest and he asked what the point of having laws was, if it meant letting billions of people die. Nashoda agreed with him and she said that was why they were breaking those laws by being here. By telling Jake the truth, they were committing a serious crime. But they didn't care anymore because Earth was the birthplace of their people. It was sacred ground and they couldn't just sit back and watch it burn. The room fell silent and Jake struggled to process everything. The world was going to end in a few months and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Except that wasn't quite true. Nashoda leaned forward and her golden eyes locked onto Jake's. She told him there was a way to save Earth, but it was dangerous, and it would require incredible courage. Jake swallowed hard and he told her to explain. Nashoda told Jake about the waypoint, and her words painted a picture of something ancient and powerful. Hidden beneath the New Mexico desert not far from his ranch, there was a facility that had been placed there thousands of years ago. The same visitors who had befriended Earth's indigenous peoples had left it behind as a gift and a test. It was called a waypoint and it was a communications beacon that could send a message across the entire galaxy in an instant. But the waypoint was more than just a communication device, and Ahiga explained this part carefully. It was also a trial and a test of worthiness. To activate the beacon, a human had to prove their worth by facing challenges that were designed by the ancestors. These challenges would test everything about a person, and they would push them to their absolute limits. If someone failed the trials, they would die and the beacon would remain silent. If they succeeded, the message would reach the Federation and help would come. Jake listened to all of this and his mouth went dry. He asked the obvious question and he wanted to know why it had to be a human. Why couldn't Nashoda or Ahiga activate the beacon themselves? Nashoda shook her head sadly, and she explained that the waypoint was specifically designed to respond only to pure humans. Her people carried modified genetics and the beacon would reject them. It had to be someone from Earth and someone who had never left the planet. The next question was even more obvious, and Jake asked why it had to be him. Why couldn't they tell the government or the military or someone with actual power and resources? Ahiga stood up and he walked to the window. He looked out at the desert and he spoke without turning around. He said that the beacon required something specific and something rare. It required purity of intention and courage without the desire for glory. It required sacrifice without any expectation of reward. Nashoda continued where her brother left off. She said that governments were filled with politics and bureaucracy, and people who wanted credit and recognition. Militaries sought victory and honor and medals to pin on their chests. But Jake was different. He was a poor rancher who had saved 2 dying strangers because it was the right thing to do. He hadn't asked for anything in return, and he hadn't called the authorities to claim some reward. He had just helped because that was who he was. Jake felt sick to his stomach and he wanted to argue. He wanted to tell them they were wrong about him and that he wasn't special or pure or any of those things. He was just a man who had made a simple choice and nothing more. But when he looked at their faces, he saw absolute certainty there. They believed in him completely, and that belief was almost harder to bear than the responsibility itself. That night, Jake couldn't sleep, and he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. He thought about his life and how small it had been. He had inherited this ranch from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. 3 generations of Morrison men who had all been poor and stubborn and tied to land that barely sustained them. Jake had never married because no woman wanted to share his poverty. He had never had children because he could barely feed himself. He had never done anything remarkable or worth remembering, but now 2 alien warriors were telling him that the fate of the entire human race might rest on his shoulders. It was absurd, and it was terrifying, and it was completely unfair. Jake was nobody, and he had no business being involved in something this important. Yet here he was, and the choice was his to make. He could refuse, and maybe the twins would find someone else, or maybe Earth would just die when the swarm arrived. Or he could accept and try to do the impossible. By the time the sun came up, Jake had made his decision. It wasn't really a choice at all, because Jake Morrison had never been able to walk away from someone who needed help. If the whole world needed him, then he would do whatever he could, even if it killed him. He walked into the living room where the twins were already awake and waiting. He told them he would do it, and he asked them to show him where the waypoint was. The twins had healed enough to travel, and Nashoda's leg was still tender but functional. They loaded into Jake's old truck, and Nashoda directed him deeper into the desert. They drove for hours along roads that weren't really roads at all. They passed through areas that Jake had never explored, even though he had lived here his whole life. Finally, they reached a formation of red rocks that looked like fingers reaching up toward the sky. Nashoda got out of the truck, and she approached one specific rock. She placed her hand against the stone, and Jake heard a sound like wind chimes. The ground beneath them began to shake, and Jake thought for a moment that it was an earthquake. Then a section of earth simply opened up, and stairs appeared leading down into darkness. The stairs were made of a material that looked like polished obsidian, and they seemed to glow with a faint blue light. Ahiga placed both of his massive hands on Jake's shoulders, and he looked him directly in the eyes. He said that beyond this point they could not follow. The trials were Jake's alone to face, but he wanted Jake to know that they believed in him completely. He called Jake little brother, and he said that Jake carried the hopes of 2 worlds now. Nashoda kissed Jake's forehead in a gesture that felt ceremonial and ancient. She told him to remember who he was and to remember why he had helped them. She said that was his strength, and that was what made him a warrior. Jake took a deep breath, and he started down the stairs. Behind him he heard the twins taking up defensive positions. They would guard the entrance, and they would wait for him to return. If he returned, the passage closed above him, and Jake was alone in the darkness. The blue glow from the stairs was the only light, and it cast strange shadows on the walls. Jake descended deeper and deeper until he lost track of time and distance. The stairs finally ended in a corridor that stretched out before him. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when he looked directly at them. The air tasted like metal, and something else that Jake couldn't identify. He felt like he was walking through a place that existed outside of normal time and space. The corridor branched in several directions, but something pulled him forward along one specific path. Jake walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time had no meaning down here, and his sense of direction was completely gone. He just followed the pull and trusted that it would lead him where he needed to go. Finally, the corridor opened up into a vast circular chamber, and Jake stopped at the entrance. The floor was made of something that looked like polished black glass, and it reflected his image back at him. The moment Jake stepped into the chamber, everything changed. Holograms materialized all around him, and they were so realistic that Jake actually jumped backward. They were people, or at least they looked like people. They were humans, or close enough that the differences were subtle. But they were all sick and dying, and they reached out to Jake with desperate, pleading eyes. A voice echoed through the chamber, and it spoke in English but with strange harmonics underneath. The voice told Jake that resources were limited, and that he possessed medicine that could save some of the people but not all of them. He had to choose who would live and who would die. Jake felt his heart hammer in his chest because this was impossible. How could anyone make this choice, and how could anyone live with themselves afterward? But the voice had given him a task, and Jake knew that this was the first trial. He looked at all the desperate faces surrounding him, and he tried to think. There were old people and young people and children and adults. There were those who looked strong and those who looked weak. How was he supposed to decide who deserved to live more than anyone else? Jake stood frozen for a long time, and his mind raced through possibilities. Finally, he made his choice. Jake didn't choose based on age or health or any logical criteria. He chose the people who reached out not just for themselves but for others. The old woman who begged him to save the children. The young man who wanted medicine for his mother. The father who asked for nothing for himself but everything for his daughter. Jake saved those who showed love and compassion even in their dying moments. He saved those who thought of others first. When he made his final selection, the holograms vanished like smoke. The voice returned, and it told him that he had passed. Compassion over utility, heart over logic. These were the words the voice used, and Jake felt relief wash over him. But he knew this was only the beginning, and more trials waited ahead. He left the chamber and continued down another corridor until he reached the second test. The moment Jake stepped into the second chamber, everything changed. The walls seemed to dissolve, and suddenly he was standing on a narrow bridge made of pure light. Below him there was nothing but darkness that stretched down forever. Jake could hear things moving in that darkness, and the sounds made his skin crawl. There were screams and crashes and the sound of worlds dying. The bridge was barely a foot wide, and one wrong step would send him falling into the void. The voice spoke again and told him to cross the bridge. It told him not to look down and not to falter. Simple instructions, but Jake's legs felt like they had turned to stone. Every instinct screamed at him to get down on his hands and knees and crawl, but he knew that wasn't the point of this test. This was about courage and about facing fear head-on. Jake took his first step onto the bridge. The light felt solid under his feet, but it also felt wrong somehow. Jake kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he took another step. Then another. Sweat poured down his face, and his heart was beating so hard he thought it might explode. The sounds from below grew louder and more insistent. They called to him, and they tempted him to look down. Jake gritted his teeth, and he kept walking. Halfway across the bridge, his foot slipped. Jake's arms windmilled wildly, and for one terrible moment he started to fall. Without thinking, he looked down, and what he saw almost destroyed him. The void showed him visions of Earth burning. He saw cities reduced to ash and humanity screaming as the swarm descended. He saw his ranch and his cattle and everything he had ever known turn to dust. Above it all floated words that burned into his mind. This is what happens if you fail. Fear should have frozen Jake in place. Fear should have sent him tumbling into the void. But Jake had lived 30 years on a failing ranch, and he had learned something that comfortable people never understood. Fear was just another burden, and you carried it until you couldn't, and then you carried it anyway. Jake pulled himself back onto the bridge with strength he didn't know he possessed. He kept walking, and he didn't look down again. When Jake reached the other side of the bridge, he collapsed to his knees. The void vanished, and solid walls appeared around him again. The voice spoke and told him that he had passed. Courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite it. Jake wanted to rest, but he knew there was no time. He forced himself to stand, and he moved on to the third trial. The third chamber was small and almost empty. The only thing in it was a mirror that hung in the air without any support. Jake approached cautiously, and he looked at his reflection. Something was wrong with what he saw. The reflection looked tired and defeated and older than Jake actually was. Then the reflection's mouth moved, and Jake heard words in his head. The reflection told him he was nobody. A poor rancher who had never amounted to anything. It asked him how he thought he could save the world when he couldn't even save himself. It told him that his father had died disappointed in him, and that his mother had left because she couldn't stand the poverty. It said he was alone because nobody had ever wanted him. Every word cut deeper than any knife because they were all true or true enough that Jake couldn't deny them. The reflection continued its assault, and it told Jake he should have left the aliens in the desert. He should have called the authorities and let someone else deal with it. The reflection said Jake was going to fail and that everyone on Earth would die because he wasn't good enough. Jake stared at his reflection for a long time, and something inside him shifted. He started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter and exhausted, but it was genuine. Jake told his reflection that it was right. He was nobody, and he was a failure by most standards. He was alone, and he was poor, and he probably would fail. The reflection smiled cruelly, thinking it had won. But Jake stepped closer to the mirror, and his eyes locked onto his own reflection. He said that he was nobody special, but he was here. He was the guy who didn't leave strangers to die in the desert. He was the guy who shared his food and his home with people who could have crushed him. He was the guy who was standing in this impossible place trying to save a world that had never given him much reason to care. Jake said he accepted the truth about himself. He was who he was, and who he was happened to be someone who helped when he could, even when it was hard and even when it seemed impossible. The mirror shattered, but not violently. It dissolved into light, and the pieces floated in the air. In each shard, Jake saw different versions of himself. A rich Jake, a powerful Jake, a famous Jake. All of them turned away from the twins in the desert because they were too important or too busy to help. The voice spoke again and told Jake he had passed. Self-awareness without self-pity. Humility without worthlessness. Jake moved to the final chamber, and it was the smallest of all. In the center floated a sphere of pure light that hurt to look at directly. The voice spoke one last time, and its words carried the weight of ages. It told Jake to place his hand upon the beacon and to accept the burden of speaking for his world. But it also warned him that if the Federation came, everything would change. The secret would be revealed, and humanity's independence would be lost. Earth would become part of something larger with all the complications that came with it. Jake stood before the beacon, and he felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. He wasn't a president or a king. He had no right to make choices for billions of people. What if they didn't want to be saved at the cost of their freedom? What if he was making a terrible mistake? But then he thought about Nashota and Ahiga waiting above. He thought about their story, and about Earth's indigenous peoples ascending to the stars. He thought about the swarm and about everything ending in silence. Jake Morrison reached out and he placed his hand on the beacon. The moment his skin made contact, his consciousness exploded outward. He was no longer in the chamber. He was everywhere and nowhere. His mind scattered across distances that made galaxies look like grains of sand. Jake tried to scream, but he had no mouth. He tried to close his eyes, but he had no eyes to close. He was pure awareness floating in the vast emptiness between stars. Jake's mind stretched across space and he saw them. The people. They were everywhere, and their ships numbered in the millions. They inhabited countless worlds, and they had built civilizations that spanned entire star systems. They were warriors and scholars and artists and builders. They carried the blood of Earth's indigenous tribes mixed with genetics from the stars. They were magnificent and terrible and beautiful all at once. They were what humanity could become if it survived long enough to grow, and they saw him. Jake felt their attention turn toward him like the focused beam of a billion suns. He tried to form words, but he had no idea how to communicate in this state. Then suddenly Nashota was there with him, not physically but in spirit. Her consciousness merged with his and lent him strength. Ahiga joined them moments later, and Jake finally understood what was happening. The twins had placed their own essences into the beacon when they told him the secret. They were part of the message now, and they vouched for him with their very souls. Together, the three of them showed the people what was coming. They showed the swarm and the threat it posed. They showed Earth vulnerable and undefended. They showed the birthplace of their most sacred traditions about to be consumed by mindless machines. The response from the people was immediate and overwhelming. Jake felt their rage and their determination wash over him like a tidal wave. They were coming and nothing would stop them. The people were not just going to defend Earth, they were going to reclaim it. This was holy ground and the place where everything had begun. They would arrive with fleets that could blot out the sun. They would bring weapons that could crack planets in half. The swarm would face something it had never encountered before. It would face warriors who fought not for territory or resources, but for the graves of their ancestors. It would face the combined fury of 1,000 worlds united by blood and tradition. Jake tried to process the scale of what he was seeing, but it was too much. His human mind wasn't designed to comprehend distances and numbers this vast. He felt himself being pulled back, and the sensation was like being born in reverse. His consciousness slammed back into his body with enough force to knock him off his feet. Jake collapsed in the chamber, gasping for air. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, and his head felt like it was splitting in two. The beacon pulsed 3 times and then went dark. The message was sent. Jake had done what he came here to do, but now he had to get back to the surface. He crawled toward the exit on his hands and knees because standing was impossible. His body felt like it had been turned inside out and put back together wrong. But he kept moving because he had to tell the twins that he succeeded. He had to let them know that help was coming. The journey back up the stairs took forever. Jake lost track of time, and he may have blacked out a few times. He just kept climbing and climbing until finally he saw a light above him. The entrance to the waypoint opened and desert sun flooded down the stairs. Jake pulled himself up the last few steps and collapsed on the hot sand. The twins were there immediately, and they dropped to their knees beside him. Nashota cradled Jake's head in her lap, and Ahiga checked him for injuries. Both twins were crying, and their tears fell on Jake's face. Ahiga pressed his forehead to the ground in a gesture of profound respect. He called Jake Honored One, and he said that Jake had done what none of them could do. He said Jake had saved 2 worlds this day. Nashota's voice was thick with emotion as she told Jake that the people had heard the message, and that they were coming. But then Nashoda's expression changed, and fear crept into her golden eyes. She told Jake that the swarm was closer than they had thought. Much closer. They had been tracking the swarm fleet for weeks and doing calculations. The original estimate of 3 or 4 months had been wrong. The swarm would arrive in days, not months. Jake's blood ran cold and he asked how many days. Nashoda's voice was barely a whisper when she answered. 5 days, maybe 6 at most. Then the swarm would reach Earth and the slaughter would begin. The Federation fleet was coming, but they were still weeks away. They would arrive too late to save anyone. Earth was going to burn and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Jake lay there on the sand and he wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. He had completed the trials and activated the beacon and done everything right. But it wouldn't matter because help wasn't going to arrive in time. Ahiga helped Jake to his feet and they made their way back to the truck. The drive back to the ranch was silent and heavy with dread. Jake's mind raced trying to think of something they could do, some way to buy more time or to delay the swarm. But what could one poor rancher and 2 wounded aliens do against a force that consumed entire planets? It seemed hopeless, and Jake had never felt so powerless in his life. When they reached the ranch, the twins immediately went to work. They salvaged what they could from their crashed ship, and they managed to repair some of their communication equipment. Nashoda sent out broadcasts on every frequency that humans used. She warned about the coming threat, and she gave exact coordinates and timing. She told anyone who would listen that Earth had 5 days to prepare for an extinction-level event. Most people ignored the warnings or dismissed them as an elaborate hoax, but some listened. Some believed. Scientists picked up the strange broadcasts and started tracking unusual readings in space. Military officials who had encountered unexplained phenomena before took the warnings seriously. Ordinary people who had always believed in life beyond Earth suddenly had their suspicions confirmed in the worst possible way. Panic began to spread slowly at first, but then faster and faster. The government came on the 3rd day. Black helicopters descended on Jake's ranch in a show of force that was both impressive and terrifying. Soldiers poured out and surrounded the property with weapons drawn. Men in dark suits emerged and demanded answers. Jake was arrested immediately and the twins were held at gunpoint. It looked like everything was going to end in blood and bullets and the complete destruction of any hope Earth had. But then Ahiga did something unexpected. He told the men in suits about the waypoint. He offered to show them proof of everything he and Nashoda had said. The government men were skeptical, but they agreed to look. Ahiga led them to the rock formation, and he opened the entrance to the ancient facility. He took them down into the chambers and he showed them the beacon. When the lead official touched the beacon's residual energy, he saw glimpses of what Jake had experienced. That changed everything. The official stumbled back from the beacon with terror written across his face. He had seen the swarm and he had seen the people. He had seen the truth and he couldn't deny it anymore. The official made phone calls and sent messages, and within hours the information had reached the highest levels of government. The president was briefed and decisions were made. An emergency address was broadcast to the nation and then to the entire world. The president stood before cameras and told humanity that they were not alone in the universe. She explained about the swarm and the threat it posed. She gave people 5 days to prepare, and she was honest about their chances. Earth's weapons would slow the swarm but probably not stop it. Help was coming, but it might arrive too late. The president asked people to stay calm and to help each other, and to face the coming storm with courage. It was the most important speech in human history, and it changed everything forever. The world descended into controlled chaos after the president's address. Some people panicked and looted stores, while others came together in ways that were beautiful and heartbreaking. Families gathered and told each other things that should have been said years ago. Enemies forgave old grudges because none of it mattered anymore. Churches and temples filled with people seeking comfort and answers. The streets were chaotic but also strangely united in the face of extinction. Jake was released by the government and given an official apology. The men in suits actually thanked him for what he had done and told him he was a hero. Jake didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had tried his best and come up short. The twins were also released and granted full diplomatic status. Nashoda and Ahiga became the first official alien ambassadors to Earth, even though their stay would probably be very short. Military forces around the world mobilized with impressive speed. Every weapon system was brought online and every soldier was called to duty. Scientists worked around the clock trying to develop new defenses based on the limited information the twins could provide. It wasn't enough, but humans had always been good at trying anyway. The species had survived ice ages and plagues and wars. Maybe they could survive this too. Jake returned to his ranch with the twins, and they spent the remaining days preparing as best they could. The government offered to relocate them to a secure bunker deep underground, but Jake refused. If the world was going to end, he wanted to die on his own land. Nashota and Ahiga chose to stay with him because the bond they had formed was stronger than the fear of death. They were family now in all the ways that mattered. On the fourth day, Jake stood on his porch and watched the sky. It looked normal and peaceful and completely unchanged. Birds flew overhead and the desert stretched out forever in all directions. It was hard to believe that somewhere up there beyond the blue, an army of machines was coming to destroy everything. Jake thought about all the things he had never done and all the dreams he had given up on. He thought about the life he could have lived if things had been different. Nashota joined him on the porch and she handed him a cup of coffee. She had learned to make it the way Jake liked, and the gesture made him smile despite everything. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the desert. Finally, Nashota spoke, and her voice was soft but steady. She told Jake that she was glad their ship had crashed near his ranch. She said that meeting him had restored her faith in what the people were fighting for. Ahiga came out and sat on the porch steps. He was cleaning weapons that the government had provided. Human-made guns that felt like toys compared to what he was used to, but they were better than nothing. He looked up at Jake and Nashota, and he said that if they were going to die, he was honored to die with them. He said that their bond was sacred and that it would continue even after death. It was the warrior way, and Ahiga wore his certainty like armor. The fifth day arrived and the sky began to change. Jake noticed it first just after dawn. The stars that should have faded with the sunrise remained visible. Then they started to move. Telescopes and satellites tracked the approaching fleet, and the numbers were staggering. Thousands of swarm ships dropping out of faster than light travel at the edge of the solar system. They looked like insects magnified 1,000,000 times. Metallic and wrong and hungry. The first wave hit Asia because that's where Earth was positioned when the swarm arrived. Cities burned, and the footage that came through before the cameras died was nightmare fuel. The swarm drones were the size of skyscrapers, and they moved with insect-like precision. They landed and immediately began consuming everything. Buildings and roads and trees and people all went into their massive maws and came out as raw materials. Military forces engaged the swarm with everything they had. Missiles and bombs and bullets filled the air. Some drones were destroyed, and humanity cheered each small victory. But for every drone that fell, 3 more took its place. The swarm was endless and relentless. They didn't stop to rest or regroup. They just kept coming and kept consuming. Asia fell in the first 6 hours, and the swarm moved on to Europe. Jake watched the reports on his television until the power grid failed. Then he listened to radio broadcasts until those went silent too. The twins had their own equipment, and they monitored military channels. The news was universally bad. Humanity was losing and losing badly. Every defense line was overrun. Every weapon system was eventually overwhelmed. The swarm was going to win, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. By nightfall on the 5th day, the swarm had consumed half of Asia and most of Europe. Africa and South America were being evacuated, but there was nowhere safe to go. North America was next, and everyone knew it. Jake stood on his porch and watched the eastern sky. He could see flashes of light that marked battles being fought hundreds of miles away. The swarm was coming, and it would reach New Mexico soon. Nashota checked her equipment, and her face went pale. She told Jake and Ahiga that the swarm had detected the waypoint. They knew it was here, and they were sending a force specifically to destroy it. The ancient facility was a threat to them, and they wanted it eliminated. That meant Jake's ranch would be one of the first places hit when the swarm reached New Mexico. They had maybe 2 hours before the drones arrived. Ahiga suggested they run and try to reach the mountains. They could hide and maybe survive a few days longer. But Jake shook his head. He wasn't going to run from his home, and he wasn't going to let the swarm destroy the waypoint without a fight. It was a stupid decision and completely suicidal, but it was his decision to make. The twins looked at each other and then nodded. They wouldn't run either. They would stand with Jake and face whatever came. They prepared as well as they could with the limited time and resources available. Jake loaded every gun he owned and placed ammunition where he could reach it quickly. Ahiga set up defensive positions around the property using whatever materials he could find. Nashota calibrated her scanner to give them early warning when the swarm got close. Then they climbed onto the roof of Jake's ranch house and they waited. The stars disappeared one by one as the swarm blotted them out. Jake could hear them now, a sound like a billion locusts mixed with grinding metal. It was the sound of the world ending, and it grew louder with each passing minute. Jake's hands shook as he gripped his rifle. He was terrified, and he wasn't ashamed to admit it. But he was also determined to go down fighting. The first drone appeared on the horizon just as the sun was setting. It was massive and wrong, and it moved with purpose. More drones followed until the entire horizon was filled with them. They came in a wave of metal and hunger and death. Jake took aim at the lead drone and he fired. The bullet struck the machine, and somehow, impossibly, it fell from the sky. Jake had no idea how he had made that shot, but there was no time to think about it. Nashota and Ahiga fired their weapons and more drones fell. They fought with everything they had, and for a few minutes it looked like they might actually hold the line. But the swarm kept coming. Dozens became hundreds and hundreds became thousands. Jake's rifle overheated and he switched to another one. His shoulder ached from the recoil and his ears rang from the constant gunfire. But he kept shooting because there was nothing else to do. A drone got through their defensive fire and it struck Jake with a glancing blow. The impact shattered his shoulder and sent him tumbling from the roof. He hit the ground hard and his vision blurred. This was it. This was how he died. Not peacefully in his sleep, but torn apart by alien machines on his own property. Jake tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. He could hear Nashota screaming his name and Ahiga roaring in defiance above him. Jake lay on the ground and waited for the end. The pain in his shoulder was overwhelming and he could taste blood in his mouth. Above him he could hear the twins still fighting, but he knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The swarm was too many and too strong. This was always how it was going to end. Jake closed his eyes and thought about his father and grandfather and all the Morrison men who had lived and died on this land. At least he would die here too, and that felt right somehow. Then the sky tore open. Jake forced his eyes open and looked up. Reality itself seemed to split apart, and through the wound came light. Not the harsh light of the sun, but something softer and more beautiful. Ships poured through the opening, and they were unlike anything Jake had ever seen. They were sleek and powerful, and decorated with symbols that Jake recognized from old Apache and Navajo art. The Federation had arrived. The ships descended like angels of war, and from their weapons came beams of pure energy. Swarm drones simply ceased to exist where those beams touched them. There was no explosion or fire or debris. The machines were there one moment and gone the next. The swarm tried to fight back, but it was useless. They had never encountered technology this advanced or warriors this skilled. Within seconds, the drones attacking Jake's ranch were eliminated completely. More Federation ships appeared in Earth's orbit, and they engaged the main swarm fleet. Jake couldn't see the battle, but he could imagine it. The sky lit up with flashes that were brighter than lightning. Thunder rolled across the desert, but it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of weapons that could crack moons. The swarm had come to Earth expecting easy prey. Instead, they had walked into a trap, and now they were being slaughtered. Nashota and Ahiga climbed down from the roof and rushed to Jake's side. Nashota cradled his head, and she was crying openly. She told him to hold on, and that help was coming. Ahiga pressed his hands against Jake's shattered shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. Jake wanted to tell them it was okay and that he was just glad they had survived, but he couldn't form the words. His vision was fading, and everything felt distant and cold. A ship landed beside Jake's ranch house. It was larger than his entire property, but it touched down with surprising gentleness. A ramp extended and figures descended. They were tall and proud and wore armor that looked like it had been woven from starlight. At their head walked a woman who could have been Nashota's older sister. She wore a headdress made of what looked like living fire, and she carried herself with absolute authority. The woman approached Jake, and her expression was solemn. She knelt beside him and placed a hand on his chest. Jake felt warmth spread through his body, and the pain began to fade. She spoke, and her voice was like music. She told Jake to rest and that he had earned it. She said she was Chief Sky that burns and that she led the Fourth Fleet. She told him that her scouts had informed her of his actions and that he was the one who activated the ancient beacon. Jake tried to speak, but Sky that burns gently touched his lips. She told him there would be time for words later. Right now, he needed to heal. She gestured to others behind her, and they came forward carrying equipment that looked medical in nature. They surrounded Jake and began working on his injuries with practiced efficiency. Jake felt his consciousness slipping away, but this time he wasn't afraid. He was safe and the world was safe, and that was enough. The battle for Earth lasted 3 more hours. The swarm fought desperately, but they had never encountered anything like the people. Warriors who had spent millennia perfecting the art of war, and who combined ancient tactical wisdom with technology that seemed impossible. The swarm was eradicated completely and utterly. Not a single drone escaped to carry word of what had happened here. The people made sure of that. When Jake woke up, he was lying in a bed that was far more comfortable than anything he had ever owned. The room around him was circular and the walls glowed with soft light. Medical equipment that he didn't understand hummed quietly nearby. For a moment, Jake thought he was dreaming or dead. Then Nashota appeared in his field of vision and she smiled down at him. She told Jake that he had been unconscious for 2 days. The Federation medical team had repaired his shoulder and treated his other injuries. He was going to be fine and he would make a full recovery. Jake sat up slowly and looked around. He was on a Federation ship, and judging by the size of the room he was in, this was not a small vessel. Nashota helped him stand and she led him to a window. Jake looked out and gasped. He could see Earth from here, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. The planet hung in space like a blue and green jewel, but surrounding Earth were thousands of Federation ships. They formed a protective barrier that no enemy could penetrate. Nashota told Jake that the people had declared Earth under their direct protection. The swarm would never threaten this world again. Ahiga entered the room and his face lit up when he saw Jake standing. He embraced Jake carefully, mindful of his injuries. He told Jake that he was a legend now among the people. Word had spread about the human who completed the Waypoint trials and activated the beacon. Songs were already being written about his courage. Jake felt deeply uncomfortable with all the attention, but he didn't know how to explain that he had just done what needed to be done. Sky That Burns came to visit Jake later that day. She brought others with her, and they were all important-looking individuals wearing ceremonial dress. They stood in Jake's room and they formally thanked him for what he had done. Sky That Burns explained that the Federation Council had met and made several important decisions. Earth would be welcomed into the galactic community with full honors. Humanity would receive technology and knowledge and the protection of the Federation. But there was a price for all of this, and Sky That Burns was honest about it. Earth's isolation was over, and the planet would never be the same again. Humans would learn they were not alone, and that they were actually one of the younger species in the galaxy. Some people would handle this well and others would struggle. There would be cultural clashes and misunderstandings and growing pains. Earth was about to change in ways that no one could fully predict. Sky That Burns also told Jake that the people were establishing a permanent presence on Earth. They would build embassies and schools and training facilities. They would share their history and reconnect with the descendants of the tribes who had remained on the planet. It would be a reunion thousands of years in the making. Some of the people were already talking about returning to Earth permanently, to walk the land of their ancestors. Jake listened to all of this and tried to process it. The world he had known was gone forever. Everything was different now and would never go back to the way it had been. But maybe that was okay. Maybe humanity needed to grow up and join the larger community. Maybe this was always meant to happen and Jake had just been the catalyst. He asked Sky That Burns what would happen to him now and whether he was free to go home. Sky That Burns smiled and told him that he could go anywhere he wanted. He was a hero to 2 worlds and he would be honored wherever he went. But she also offered him a choice. The Federation was establishing a new position called Ambassador of Earth, someone who could speak for humanity and help bridge the gap between species, someone who understood both worlds and who had proven their courage and wisdom. Sky That Burns told Jake that he was the ideal candidate for this role. Jake was quiet for a long time. Ambassador of Earth, it was ridiculous and impossible and completely insane. He was just a poor rancher who had gotten lucky. But then he looked at Nashota and Ahiga, and he thought about everything they had been through together. He thought about the trials he had passed and the beacon he had activated. He thought about all the people who had died fighting the swarm, and all the people who had survived because help had arrived in time. Jake asked for time to think about the offer, and Sky That Burns granted it graciously. She told him to take all the time he needed, and that the position would wait for him. In the meantime, she arranged for Jake to return to Earth so he could see what had changed in the days since the battle. A small shuttle brought Jake and the twins back to the surface and they landed near his ranch. The property looked different now. The Federation had sent repair crews and they had fixed all the damage from the battle. Jake's house had been rebuilt, and it was actually nicer than before. His fences were mended and his cattle had been rounded up and cared for. There were also Federation personnel camped nearby. They were guarding the waypoint and making sure no one disturbed the ancient facility without permission. Jake walked through his property and tried to take it all in. This was still his land, but it also wasn't. Everything had changed, and there was no going back to the simple life he had lived before. News crews had already found him and they wanted interviews. The government wanted him to make appearances and give speeches. Everyone wanted a piece of Jake Morrison, and he didn't know how to handle any of it. Nashota found him sitting on his porch that evening, just like they had done before the swarm arrived. She sat beside him and they watched the sunset together. She asked Jake what he was thinking about, and he told her the truth. He said he didn't know if he was qualified to be an ambassador. He was just a rancher who had done what anyone should have done. Nashota laughed and told him that was exactly why he was perfect for the job. She explained that most people in positions of power wanted glory and recognition. They made decisions based on politics and personal gain, but Jake had proven that he acted based on what was right and not what benefited him. He had saved the twins without expecting anything in return. He had activated the beacon knowing he might die. He had stood and fought the swarm even when all hope was lost. Those actions showed his character, and that character was what the galaxy needed. Ahiga joined them and added his own thoughts. He said that the people had been watching humanity for a long time. They had seen great potential but also great flaws. Humans could be cruel and selfish and short-sighted, but they could also be brave and compassionate and innovative. Jake represented the best of what humanity could be, and that was why he should accept the ambassador position. The galaxy needed to see that humans were worth saving and worth including. Jake thought about their words for a long time. He had never wanted to be important or famous. He had just wanted to live quietly on his ranch and maybe make enough money to fix his roof. But that life was gone now, whether he accepted the ambassador position or not. The world knew his name and his face. People called him a hero and looked to him for leadership. He could try to run from that responsibility, but it would follow him everywhere. The next morning, Jake contacted Sky That Burns and told her he would accept the position. She seemed pleased but not surprised. She told him that training would begin immediately and that he had much to learn. The Federation was sending teachers and advisors to help him understand galactic politics and diplomacy. It would be hard work, and there would be mistakes. But Sky That Burns believed Jake was up to the challenge. The weeks that followed were overwhelming. Jake moved to a Federation embassy that had been established in Washington. He met with world leaders and Federation officials. He learned about dozens of different species and their cultures. He studied galactic history and law and protocol. His brain felt like it was going to explode from all the information, but he kept pushing forward. Nashota and Ahiga stayed with Jake through all of it. They had been officially assigned as his advisors and bodyguards. The three of them had become inseparable, and their bond had only grown stronger. Nashota taught Jake about the people and their traditions. Ahiga trained him in combat techniques that combined human and alien fighting styles. They were his friends and his family, and Jake couldn't imagine going through this without them. 6 months after the swarm attack, Earth had changed dramatically. Federation technology was being shared, and human scientists were making breakthroughs that would have taken centuries otherwise. Diseases were being cured and energy problems were being solved. Some people protested the alien presence and demanded that Earth remain independent. But most people recognized that joining the Federation was the best path forward. Jake attended his first Federation Council meeting, and it was terrifying. He sat in a chamber with representatives from hundreds of different worlds. Some of them looked almost human, while others were so alien that Jake had trouble processing what he was seeing. They discussed trade agreements and defense pacts and cultural exchanges. Jake listened carefully and tried to understand the complex web of relationships that bound the Federation together. When it was his turn to speak, Jake stood on shaking legs. He talked about humanity and about Earth. He acknowledged that his people were young and inexperienced compared to most species in the Federation. But he also talked about human resilience and creativity and hope. He said that humanity had much to learn but also much to offer. His speech was simple and came from the heart. When he finished, there was silence, and then the chamber erupted in applause. Sky That Burns approached Jake after the meeting, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. She told him that he had done well and that he was proving to be everything she had hoped. The other council members were impressed by his honesty and his humility. They saw in Jake the potential of humanity, and they were optimistic about Earth's future in the Federation. Jake felt pride swell in his chest, and for the first time he thought maybe he really could do this job. A year after activating the beacon, Jake returned to his ranch for a visit. The property was still his, even though he rarely had time to stay there anymore. Federation personnel still guarded the waypoint, but they had built proper facilities now. The ancient site had become a place of pilgrimage for the people who wanted to connect with their Earth heritage. Jake walked through his land and remembered the man he had been before all of this started. That Jake had been poor and lonely and convinced his life didn't matter. He had been wrong about that last part. Every life mattered, and every choice had consequences that rippled outward. Jake's choice to help two dying strangers had saved two worlds and changed the course of history. It was humbling and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Nashoda and Ahiga stood beside Jake and looked out over the desert. Ahiga said that the people had a saying about moments like this. Great things often begin with small acts of kindness. The universe remembered those acts and rewarded them in unexpected ways. Jake had proven that truth and his story would be told for generations. Children on 1,000 worlds would learn about the poor rancher who became a bridge between species. Jake smiled and told them he still didn't feel like a hero. He was just doing his best and hoping he didn't mess things up too badly. Nashoda laughed and said that was what made him perfect. Real heroes didn't seek glory or recognition. They just did what needed to be done and tried to help where they could. Jake had that quality in abundance, and it would serve him well in the years to come. As the sun set over the New Mexico desert, Jake thought about the future. Earth was part of something larger now, and humanity had joined the galactic community. There would be challenges ahead and conflicts and misunderstandings, but there would also be opportunities and friendships and growth. Humans would travel to the stars and walk on alien worlds. They would learn and teach and become something more than they had been, and Jake Morrison would be there to guide them through it all. The poor rancher who had saved two giant Apache twins and learned a secret that changed everything. He wasn't alone anymore, and he never would be again. He had found family among the stars and purpose in places he never expected. His small life had become something extraordinary, and that was terrifying but also beautiful. Jake looked at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They didn't look distant anymore. They looked like neighbors and friends and possibilities. Earth's isolation was over, and the planet had taken its first steps into a much larger universe. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, and Jake Morrison, nobody special, stood at the center of it all and smiled, because he finally understood that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could echo across the entire galaxy and change everything forever.